All right, so welcome back, everyone. It's now we're moving to the second part of the day where we're talking about neurotechnology and society. And this afternoon we'll be primarily discussing how to innovate responsibly. And so we have an exciting panel of speakers coming from different and complementary horizons that will help us address this question of responsible innovation. So I'm very glad to introduce our very first speaker, who is joining us from the US. So Jennifer French, good morning for you. And so Jennifer is the founder and executive director of the Neurotech Network. It's a nonprofit organization that focuses on education and advocacy for neurotechnologies. She has helped launch successful divisions in such organizations such as the Bombardier Capital and Connection, as well as nonprofit organization and community patient engagement programs. So with no further ado, Jen, I will let you share with us your presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Bonjour, everyone. It's wonderful to see everyone here today and wonderful to talk to you about this topic. Stephanie did a great job of introducing Neurotech Network, and today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, learning from the experience, about how we can integrate community engagement into neurotechnology development. Another organization I would like to introduce you to is the American Brain Coalition. I sit on the board of that organization, and it's an organization in the US of a coalition of patient advocacy organizations centered around moving forward advancements in care for the brain and central nervous system in the US. So it's really a great network of advocacy organizations. But today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the lived experience and what that is. So you see me here from, my shoulders up, and at one point I was a person that was extremely active, and I was a very active snowboarder before my injury. I did have a spinal cord injury in a snowboarding accident 26 years ago. And since then, I've been living with implanted neural prosthesis. So for 25 of the 26 years, I've been involved in a clinical trial looking at implanted technologies into paralyzed limbs and how we can use those for function. So understanding that long-term experience of being in a clinical trial. But also there's another point of lived experience, and I always bring this back to a quote from Michael J. Fox, who lives with Parkinson's disease. But he really sends a very straight message forward that it's very simple, that the people that are living with the condition are really the people who are experts. So we can study a condition, we can study technology to treat that condition, but we also have to respect those with lived experience because they live with a chronic condition 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And probably have the most breadth of experience of that condition. So bringing in people with lived experience can really enhance our development of not only medical devices, but neurotechnology, because it's such an interactive division of the medical device industry. So today I wanted to talk to you a little bit, not only about lived experience, giving you that introduction, but also about some of the principles of engagement, but also some of the lessons that we've learned from clinical trial participation and experience, as well as a quick introduction to the neurotech landscape, which I'm sure you've heard in the morning, but also a little bit about collaborative communities, which is a concept that we've been developing here in the US. So first, for a definition of when we think about engagement, we think about participant engagement, and participant engagement is looking at interacting with and keeping a clinical study participant involved during the study, but also the process of including that person's lived experience after the completion of the study. So when we think about clinical trial participants, we think about those who are the early adopters of technology, those that we can see in what we've seen in early studies of neurotechnology, of this lived experience that is very unique in neurotechnology. So here we have Sylvia, who is one of the early users of the telehealth Trio device. She lives with essential tremor. The Phil, who lives with ALS, was one of the first people to be implanted with the Stentrone from Synchron Technologies. Jan here is one of the early BrainGate users who used a robotic device. She is fully paralyzed from the neck down, but was able to use a robotic arm using a brain-computer interface as well. Danielle is an early user of a technology for migraine headaches, a non-invasive device. And Dennis is one of the early clinical trial participants in the Sensi trial for restoration of sensation for those with upper limb amputation. And you can see from their quotes that these technologies and the experience can really bring a profound impact on people's lives. And I think that's something we have to think about as we include people in our clinical trials, and also what we can learn from them. And also, this can be documented in various books. The one I would like to highlight is The Bionic Pioneers, which is a collection of 10 stories of early users of neurotechnology and what we can learn from them. And those are only 10. There are a lot of those, but we can explore even more the breadth of the experience of those who are the early adopters. And there's some things that we learn about those trial participants. And there's gains and there's concerns that we should really bring forward. So these were brought forward for some of the papers that have been written about the patient experience and the participant experience. And what do we gain from these early feasibility studies is we learn that we can understand some of that firsthand insights. We can look at the early interventions, and we can start to adapt, some of the technology that we're developing from understanding that experience. But also we build this relationship between the researcher and the participant, and we can do some co-generation of ideas of how the technology can move forward, because we get a good window into what the early user experience is like. So we can gain a lot from engaging with the participants in the trials, even though we are collecting data from them. But there are concerns that we should think about as well in terms of the vulnerability of people who are in these trials, meaning that we're providing some hope to them, and we have to think about the vulnerabilities that are on the other side, but also in terms of the limited scope. So we don't want to do inferences about the entire community just from a small pilot trial of, say, interacting with 10 people. So we have to be respectful of that scope of the experience. We also have to be very respectful of the power structures that exist. If we're providing a treatment and we're giving a gain to somebody that is a participant in a trial, that researcher, that person that holds the key, if you will, to that technology does have a power structure over the person that is involved in that trial. So we need to be respectful of that, and which can put us into some of these ethical entanglements, which I know some of our other speakers this afternoon will go into. We also have to be respectful of the fact that we're gaining advisement from these participants. They're giving us valuable feedback, but it's uncompensated. And our ethic boards and our institutional review boards, rightfully so, don't want the participants to be compensated, because we don't want ulterior motives for participating in clinical trials. But at the same time, we have to be respectful of the participants' time on how much advisement we gain. So that can be some of the concerns that we face. But what have we learned on some of the larger surveys of people who have participated in clinical trials? these are some of the lessons learned, and I think we can reflect as we look at the development of neurotechnologies on what is that experience and really start to challenge some of our assumptions that we make. So, for instance, when we look at why people join clinical trials, there's a variety of reasons. Some of them are people get fatigue, search fatigue. If they have a chronic condition where there is no quote unquote cure, they're searching for a solution for their condition, and sometimes they gain fatigue and decide to join a clinical trial, which also leads into desperation. But people also join clinical trials for altruistic reasons of being able to benefit science, to help out the community, and really being able to interact with the world. So there's a lot of reasons why people might join a clinical trial. So I think we also have to understand those motivations. But the interesting thing too is there's so many assumptions about um, how people learn about clinical trials is through the medical establishments. And that's definitely not true that what we've seen from surveys. Most people find out about clinical trials through patient advocacy groups, through newsletters, through social media, and maybe through their primary care physician, but not necessarily through the specialists. So we have to think about how we're recruiting for those trials, but also the difficulty of the complex language that comes with joining trials and the issues around informed consent. Also, sometimes people join trials because they think they're going to get superior care, and then sometimes they do because they get access to specialists that they normally would not get access to. So we need to be respectful of that, but also understand the burdens of the unknowns. And we can do a better job of educating participants in the trials about what the time commitment is, transportation to and from sites, wait times that they might have, and how we communicate with them. And we see that communication lead over into understanding once they are in the trial. So some of the frustrations can be around unresponsive communication or on trial follow-up. But there's also vulnerabilities, as I mentioned earlier, but there can be impacts on agency, sense of self and identity. But again, as I mentioned, of uncompensated advisement, we also have to be concerned about uncompensated risks and burdens that happen to trial participants. Particularly one that tends to be ignored is caregiver dependencies. So many times we look at the participant, but we don't always look at the burden on the caregiver or on the family to have that person participate in the trial. Also understanding that there's a dual role that people play where they could be an object, meaning that you're collecting data off of them in a study, but also they can be an active contributor. So they're actually living into two different roles in a clinical trial. But also there's positive aspects about involved in a clinical trial, meaning that they do have, people feel that they have a regular communication with people and there are multiple contacts and a feeling of being cared for. So thinking about those lessons learned from larger studies of people participating in trials are things that we can bring back to the development of neurotechnology. One unique thing about neurotechnology too is that has surfaced recently is about post-trial access. And this was out of a survey for implanted neural devices, looking that over 60% of participants either have no recollection or are unclear about their response about what the post-trial access was offered to them prior to surgery. I think that's something we need to be very careful of. But also the thoughts about who pays for that device and who pays for the treatment after the trial, the perspectives of the participants change pre-surgery to post-surgery, meaning that many people think that pre-surgery insurance should be paying for their access post-study, but that perspective changes post-surgery when they're looking at the device manufacturer or the sponsor. Alternatively, when asked for the investigators, this was again in the same study, or sorry, a different study, looking at what investigators thought of post-trial care is that, 95% agree that there are ethical obligations of providing post-trial access to the neural technologies. And many of them include this in their consent agreements and their ethical applications. But also looking at what was required of those plans for post-trial or post-care. IRB boards or ethics boards are very much interested in this question, and we're starting to see more involvement in our regulatory agencies. So this leads to some gaps that we see. So we're talking about clinical trial participant engagement. And really, when we're thinking about engagement, when we think about the adoption curve, when we're engaging with clinical trial participants, many times we're looking at the early market. We're looking at these innovators and these early adopters, people who are willing to take a risk, and people who are really involved in those early adoptions of technology. But if we really want neurotechnology to be widespread and widely adopted, we really have to start looking at this mainstream market. So this is a common adoption curve for any technology, whether it's a phone or a computer or a medical device. But we really have to start. One of the gaps that we see is we don't always engage that larger community. One other gap that we see in technology development is that many times we focus on this medical model here. But really, we have to start to think about the social model of engagement of people living with chronic conditions. So many times we think of just them in the medical model about how they live with that condition, but we don't always think about how they live with that condition in society. And so that's a gap that we see in the development of neurotechnology that we need to address. When we think about design thinking, this is a very iterative process. So many times we think about an idea, we define it, we understand the people that are involved with it, and we build prototypes and we test it, and it becomes a very iterative process. But if we're only focusing on the clinical trial participants, many times we're only focusing on this side, the generating out ideas and the testing of our prototypes, and not always looking at this other side of the iterative process. So that's another gap that exists, that if we only focus in on participant engagement, the participant engagement for those people who are in clinical trials. And that is where community engagement comes in. And this is where community engagement can help us fill those gaps. So community engagement, by definition, is working collaboratively with and through groups of people with lived experience throughout the research and development process. So we can learn from the pharmaceutical industry. These are statistics that are pulled from pharmaceutical industry of lessons learned for not engaging with communities. We've seen that 60% of protocols requiring one or more amendments that really could be avoided if they included those in the community. I won't read the other ones of these, but to point out that without that community engagement, there's a lot of protocol amendments, clinical trial failures in recruitment and retention because of not including the community to truly understand that, so we can build smart clinical trial protocols. We also know, as we mentioned in the other survey, is that most people don't find out about their clinical trials through their doctor. It's not typically doctor recommended. We also know that 20% of sponsors, these are people who sponsor clinical trials, seek out patient input on the operations of it. Only 20%. The other 80% do not. And that's where we see some of the failures. Also, only about 44% of clinical trials address transportation for people involvement in clinical trials, which tends to put an extra expense burden on clinical trial participants and also leads to limited engagement. And I think this is probably the most striking statistic that we can find from sponsors' feedback on community engagement, meaning that 500 sponsors have realized a 500 multiple gain on an initial investment of $100,000 in inpatient engagement. So let me put this another way. For clinical trial sponsors that invested $100,000 in patient engagement, realized a 500-time gain in their investment. So there is actually an economic argument as to why we should involve communities and why it's important. And this is what we've seen from these are examples from our friends at the US FDA, Federal Drug Administration, Federal Drug and Device Administration in the US, about potential engagement and results. So we can gain faster enrollment, more diverse populations. We have greater participation enhancements in understanding the results and the protocols, fewer protocol revisions, as I mentioned before. So there are definitely gains to have from engaging the community that we can see in clinical trial, not only participation, but enrollment, but also what we learn afterwards about those outcomes. And there are frameworks for community engagement. I won't go into these in detail, but to know that there are many frameworks out there on community engagement. This one is from the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative and adapted with the Parkinson's Foundation. But it looks at how do we engage the community in all developments throughout the research and development process. So even when we're in this pre-discovery phase, we can start to engage with the community. And in terms of ideation, how do we come up with these ideas, understanding mechanisms, understanding the disease, even going all the way down to when we're looking at clinical trials, which I've mentioned earlier, which tends to be the place where we focus, but also post-trial as well. So I think there's a lot to gain and a lot of activity that we can see where we can gain in our clinical trial development and using this type of framework. And this is just one of many. Another way to look at this is looking at engagement framework from a continuum of engagement. So how do we engage, right? When we think about this framework was developed by PCORI, which is an institute that is here in the United States. But we look at, many times we look at, we can have surveys or roundtables or focus groups with our community partners to learn about them. But as we build on the decision-making and the development and how do we engage, we can move along to consultation, to true collaboration for having steering committees and involving stakeholders in a multidisciplinary way, but also doing some shared leadership as well. So when we look about along the continuum of maybe a snapshot of just input to how do we do this iterative process of involving the community, this is a framework that has been developed as well. And again, this is the source here on the bottom. And this is a global movement. What we call the patient engagement or the community engagement movement is actually throughout the world, and we're starting to see a lot of organizations to do so. In Europe, UPADI has been around for quite some time, but there are others around the world that are working on community engagement and building these frameworks and understanding how we engage with communities. This is developed by the Patient-Focused Medicine Development based in the UK. So let's switch gears a little bit. In my last few minutes with you is to talk about the neurotech ecosystem. And we are at a very exciting time in neurotechnology, where we're in a very changing environment. We know that we have a wide array of people living with neurological conditions. We know that there's been significant development. In the US, we have the Brain Initiative. In Europe, we have the Human Brain Project. where we've invested quite a bit in not only brain science, but also in understanding the nervous system of the human experience. But we also have seen a great spark in evolution in technology, not only those of implanted devices, how we've been able to consolidate and look at implanted devices becoming more minimally invasive, but also external devices, but also the integration of machine learning and artificial intelligence. But we still continue to struggle with translation and breakthrough and actually end user adoption. This is one of the big challenges that we have in neurotechnology. And we see this in what we call the double valley of death. So when we look at translating technologies out of university and starting to do into early trials, that's where we start to see the first level of the valley of death, but there's also a second level of valley of death, which we call adoption and acceptance. So again, that is where we get true clinical adoption through true end user acceptance of the technology. And we need to be aware of these two so we can overcome them and bridge them. And how do we do that? So there are challenges to overcome these chasms. And we're starting to come up with frameworks on how to do that. We've also seen in neurotechnology this a level of what we call abandonment, and we've seen this with many years ago where cyberkinetics went out of business for brain-computer interfaces, with neurocontrol going out of business with an implanted prosthesis for the hand for people with paralysis, leaving 350 people with implanted devices that are unserviced. And even more recently, we've seen the advent of the retinal prosthesis for people who have implanted retinal prosthesis to restore sight, with Second Sight going out of business earlier for a lot of folks who are implanted with those devices and not being able to be serviced. Now, there are efforts to bring this back, but the same sense is that we have to be very conscious of this aura of abandonment. We've also seen a lot of ethical, legal, social, and cultural issues arise, and I know our other speakers will speak to this much more, so I won't go into depth in this, but these are definitely issues that we need to address to help overcome some of these, the valley of death and adoption. And how do we do that? We're coming up with a new framework for this. In the US, we're looking at developing, and we have started to develop what's called collaborative communities. And this is a relatively new concept here in the United States, and I know there's some developments there in Europe. But the idea is to bring together multi-stakeholders to help solve some of these challenges that we see with new technology coming forward, and trying to get over those valleys of death. And I'll give you a quick story about one of the early collaborative communities in the US was actually in ophthalmology. It was for the intraocular lens. This was a technology that was basically stuck and was not able to develop because they didn't have good outcome measures. They didn't have a good way for diagnosis and delivery. And the way that they helped to solve these problems is they pulled together a collaborative community of multi-stakeholders that included clinicians, researchers, industry, patient advocacy organizations, federal agencies, payers, to help solve the problems that were surrounding the adoption and the acceptance of intraocular lens. And today, we have a very vibrant industry in this. So this is a fantastic use case of using collaborative communities to help solve very difficult problems of adoption and acceptance. So what is a collaborative community? They're actually very transparent. They're continuing forums of both public and private sector members, but they also get together and have shared objectives, solve shared challenges, and have collective opportunities. So bringing up diverse stakeholders together. And they're very transparent. That's part of the key points of collaborative communities. They have a means of engaging a broad amount of stakeholders, as I've already mentioned. But even more so is that they operate in what's called a pre-competitive space, and also in focus on the development of regulatory science. I'm going to go into those two in just a little bit more detail. So what is the pre-competitive space? For the most recently launched implantable BCI collaborative community, we look at some of the challenges in the ideation around technical and clinical standards about user preferences and outcomes. But other activities which sit outside of this pre-competitive space is the competitive space. And this is where industry starts to compete directly with each other when we look at intellectual property and commercialization, when we look at the development of clinical trials, when we look at corporate sponsorships. So those sit outside of the collaborative community. But what's much more is what we can solve in the pre-competitive space collectively. And a great example of that is something from a completely separate industry is when we think about the development of USB. USB was actually developed by a collaboration of those within industry and other stakeholders and technology developers to come up with this universal design for being able to translate data between computers, if you will, through a USB drive. And this is a concept that is very underutilized in medicine, and we're trying to bring this to medicine. So this is where we can operate in the pre-competitive space. And regulatory science is also a key in developing use cases and understanding how we can pull together adoption, regulatory approval, and payers into medicine and into innovative technologies. So typically we have technology development when we think about the data that comes along with it, but we need that regulatory science to be able to integrate that technology into society. And regulatory science has a very specific language. This paper was actually published 2 years ago about the language around regulatory science, and that there is a distinct difference between intended use and indication of use. And when we look at the language of the regulatory science, we can start to break down what is needed and what is the information that we need to be able to get to adoption of technology. Finally, as I mentioned, we recently launched the Implantable Brain-Computer Interface Collaborative Community. You can find more about it here at this website. And right now we are focusing on the US, but we will plan to expand into international here in the near future. So that concludes my presentation, but I want to be able to open it up for questions.